Hello class, how are you today? Looks like we're about halfway done with this semester, so congratulations, great job so far. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 8, the LGBT community and the criminal justice system. The book does a really good job about talking about history of these groups and again how history has done a lot of bad things to the name of what these groups stand for. So we're going to go over some of the history and how a lot of discrimination has occurred with this group and how nowadays it's developed to a more so relaxed atmosphere with LGBT folks. So again, a lot of history, a lot of persecution that has gone on with these groups needlessly. So as we start, we're going to first talk about the criminal justice system. And when we talk about the criminal justice system and these groups, what does the public think about homosexuality? The research shows it's divided about same-sex marriages. I'm sure everybody knows someone that is a gay person or a homosexual person, depending on what terminology they use. So it's not as pervasive as people think, but it is in line with America right now. This is how it is. And some people that have bad attitudes about it may need to get over it because it's here. And again, it's a choice that people have to agree with it or not. So if you don't, that's fine. Some of the conservatives talk about the roles in the family issues, having two moms or two dads, if that is the positive role model. Whereas half the families out there have just a single parent, so they don't even have a mom or a dad. It's just one or the other. So again, there's a lot of family issues that are raised. I personally know gay people, homosexual people, and they have families, they're married, they have children, they've been divorced, so they're pretty much like everybody else that I can see from my personal point of view. As we move on here, the definition of homosexuality. So have you ever looked that up or to know what that means, homosexuality? It's a Greek word and it's a Latin hybrid of it. So homo is derived from the same, from the Greek term meaning the same, and sexuality, so basically it's the same, it's sex with the same person, members of the same sex. So that's kind of the root word of homosexual. Not a negative connotation, but as we're going to see through history, there's been a lot of discrimination and persecution of homosexuals. We talked about terminology a little bit, and then the roles of the person, whether they're going to be male or female, if there is going to be such a thing in a relationship. Again, there's so many different types of folks out there that the term homosexuality really doesn't describe everybody. So again, you need to be very careful when you talk to certain people because they may not agree with the terminology that you may use. And we're going to talk about some of that in a little bit. So some history, churches have historically condemned homosexuality. They did not like it. They thought it was a sin against God. So this was written in various Bibles and scriptures about homosexuality. But homosexuality has been practiced in just about every culture known to mankind, okay, in various times. So again, the Bible, though, has had a very negative view of homosexuality. In early America, here in the United States, ministers spoke of the God who would rain fire and brimstone down upon those that engage in homosexuality. So this was talked about in church. So just think of a homosexual person back then talking about they didn't want to reveal themselves because they would fear ostracation from society. So very similar to maybe how it is today in some parts. Some more history here. Again, we talked about the scriptures that deplore homosexuality. Very, very big element in holding those accountable for their actions. You did not want to be viewed as a homosexual back in those early days as it was a curse almost for you and for your family. Also, in every colony, sodomy or anal sex was a capital offense. It was punishable by death. Say that again, it was punishable by death, while other homosexual acts were punished by whippings and fines. So in the early days, the early colonies, you could be put to death, and many were, for engaging in sodomy. So again, a very, very historical past so far with homosexuality. After the American Revolution, there was a resistance to remove the sodomy statutes that were called crimes against nature. Okay, resistance. People wanted to keep those in. So again, against the law. As time went by, a wider range and assortment of activities was also looked at, things being illegal as oral sex between men and sexual activity between women. So again, now we have come from being a biblical issue to a political issue, and people setting laws, enacting laws against homosexuality. So far there's been a lot of discrimination against homosexuals in our early days, a lot. The late 19th century, the medical profession gets involved and diagnoses homosexuality as a form of mental illness. So if you're homosexual, you're mentally ill. We need to treat you. You need to take medication to make you better, to make you different than what you are as a homosexual. So now we have science getting involved. And Freud was a very famous psychoanalyst. I'm sure you've heard of him. He concluded that homosexuality was an acquired affliction that required medical treatment. So again, you may have a mental illness, but then again, Freud says it's a acquired affliction, but you can do something about it. And some of the ways that they took the affliction away from you of homosexuality was electroshock therapy. This was in the 40s and 50s. Lobotomies, working with your brain, taking parts out. Hysterectomies, excuse me, and even castration. So these were some of the things not too long ago that were looked at to cure homosexuality. Kind of looking back now, it kind of looks kind of stupid, doesn't it? Late 19th century, red light districts pop up. Those are districts basically of prostitution houses. Literally when the red light is on, that means the house of prostitution is open. With the red light district came, after World War II, men coming home. And again, the number of gay bars began to increase in the 1940s after World War II ended. And some of those were in the red light districts. So they were gay bars or considered gay bathhouses, depending on where you live. San Francisco was very famous for having gay bathhouses. And again, it's very accepted in certain areas like San Francisco and larger cities in New York and things like that. So it wasn't necessarily looked upon as bad for certain folks. The 1950s, during the Cold War, communists were brought up to trial because they were a threat to the American way of life. And homosexuality or homosexuals were portrayed in the same manner. They looked at homosexuality during the 50s as a threat to the American way of life and investigated those who were homosexual. And these are federal trials that went on. Can you imagine that? You're on trial because of your homosexuality? Very discriminatory. This perception was so great that in 1953, not that long ago, the president issued an executive order barring gay men and lesbians from all federal jobs. You know, just talking about this is just amazing to me that this president would enact this statute. Again, I'm all for balance and everybody has their own rights, but to do this was absolute disparity and discrimination. So they are telling somebody who considers themselves homosexual, you cannot work for the federal government. Talk about discrimination. Okay, moving on. The civil rights movement helped the gay community. We'll talk about that. Basically, the gay power movement began around 1969. At the same time, the civil rights movement was going on. So together, they used each other for their own purposes, which was a positive thing. Late 70s and 80s were a turbulent time for the gay community. Do you know why? A lot of people, very famous people, white conservatives, did not like the homosexual activity that was going on. And singer Anita Bryant, who probably you've never heard of, was very famous at that time. for her commercials with orange juice. She was a singer, and she began an anti-gay campaign in Dade County, Florida. Huge. Went on TV, commercials, etc. And also, Jerry Falwell, very famous preacher, basically, for the moral majority, worked with other groups to oppose homosexuality and openly campaigned against it. So there was a lot of anti-gay things going on back in the 70s and 80s by famous conservative people. Then all of a sudden, HIV is thrust upon us in the early 80s. And if you don't remember that, I remember that when that occurred, and it was a really big deal because nobody knew where it came from. But what was known is that it only back then afflicted homosexual men. Okay, we know that's not true. We know now where it comes from. We know how to protect ourselves. But back then it was a huge deal, and it was called the gay disease because that's the only people who got it. And you died from it back then. But the threat of all that intensified the anti-gay group's efforts against homosexuals because they looked at it from a public health experience. Here's what's going to happen if you are a gay man and you engage in homosexuality. You will get AIDS, HIV, and you will die. So from a public health perspective, this was a huge blow to the anti-gay movement that people wanted to have. So moving on, though, once this happened, this actually brought together large homosexual communities to fight against AIDS and also to reinvest themselves into the public as a homosexuality should be accepted. So this actually helped and brought together the homosexual community, which was a good thing. Unfortunately, many people died because of this until a vaccine was enabled. So again, this became almost a political issue because a lot of organizations became national. And it was national because it wasn't just San Francisco or New York or Chicago. It was all over. It was in Texas, in North Carolina, in Michigan, in Idaho. So most all states came together with some sort of organization for gay pride or gay rights. So, as far as this goes, this catastrophic time of HIV in the 80s all the way to the 90s, it brought together and helped shape and change the way the gay rights movement went, which is a very positive thing. Homosexuals in the criminal justice system. So in 1990, there was a Hate Crime Statistic Act that passed in 1990, and basically it mandated the collection of victims of crimes that were basically hate crimes. So they would collect data on the race, religion, sexual orientation, and ethnicity, and then analyze those and look for patterns. So this was a very good thing that came because then statistical analysis can be looked at from law enforcement as where hate crimes are occurring, who they are occurring to, and sometimes why, and who perpetrates them. And we'll have a whole section of hate crimes coming up soon. So just be prepared for that. That's very interesting for you. Basically, homosexuality in prison life. Is it a consensual thing to do in prison, or is it a way to survive? I have supervised a lot of parolees. We never really had any conversations about homosexuality because to me it doesn't matter if you're homosexual or not. You're just a parolee, and I'm the parole agent, and this is how we're going to do things. And as far as being a correctional officer in the institution, we always heard about inmates that had been raped. I never saw that, never heard it, but I did read reports of how that happened. It's not necessarily anymore a use of force to rape somebody in prison. It's not necessarily consensual, but there's something that's called PREA, and that's the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which basically we're going to go over in a different class, but basically it's males grooming other males in order to have sex with them. So again, it's not a way to survive necessarily, because if you're threatened as a prisoner, as a person in jail or prison, you can go to the officer or the sergeant in charge of the unit, let them know what's going on, and they will put protections upon you because of that. So it's a little different from the old days where, you go in the prison cell with Bubba, and it's this big, huge guy, and he says, we're going to have sex or I'm going to kill you. So it's not really like that anymore. A little bit different. As far as HIV, That is a scare that is still there. And interestingly enough, in California prisons and most jails, condoms are given out. Here you go. Here's your toothpaste, your flip-flops, your toothbrush, your comb, your shampoo, your towel, your bedroll, and your condoms, because you might need them. So again, some people agree with that, some people don't. Does it help stop the spread of HIV? If they're used when homosexual sex or anal sex is going on, yes. Interesting though that how that's come full circle now that they're given out. So again, it's to stop the HIV spread. I've had a few females on my caseload throughout the years of parolees, and lots of females actually, mostly for drugs. And this one female, I'll never forget this conversation we had. We were talking about her incarceration because she was incarcerated for about 4 years, and she's married and has kids. And we were just talking one day, and I said, "What was your, what's the biggest deal about prison for you for being a female? Was it, was it scary? Were there gangs, or what was it like?" And she said, "The biggest thing is that when I was there," she said, "I'm married, to a guy, we have kids, but I knew a lot of other women there that said they were gay for the stay." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And she said that there were females there that would submit to homosexual activities from other female prisoners, but only because they were in prison. And during the prison stay, they would do that consensually, but once they left prison, they went back to their heterosexual way of life. So I thought that was an interesting term. She used, gay for the stay. So haven't heard that yet in any textbooks, but that was from personal experience of what she told me. Thought it was interesting. Okay, influence of HIV or AIDS on sexual behavior. Obviously, it's a huge health issue, and it can be the result of a sexual assault or consensual activity. So it not necessarily means that someone that is raped or that has a consensual sexual encounter can lead to HIV or AIDS. So we've learned a lot about that. There's a lot of pharmaceuticals out there for the treatment of HIV or AIDS. The conjugal visits in prison. In California, only a certain type of inmate can have a conjugal visit. Conjugal visit is an overnight stay with family. Usually it's to maintain the family ties. You can bring your kids and you're basically in a trailer inside the walls. And you have an overnight visit. You bring food and everything's great, but you're counted and everything else goes on. But the role of that is to maintain the family, okay? And females have that as well as males. And again, condoms are given out at that time just to ensure that there's no HIV spread or contamination that could happen during a conjugal visit. Okay, the book does a pretty good job of talking about typology of inmates. And some terminology here is kind of interesting. Joseph Fishman terms a queen in a prisoner jail as a male inmate who prefers male sexual partners with long hair or makeup, etc. That would be a queen. There's a punk or punks, and there's two types that he deems. First is the pressure punk, that are inmates that submit to homosexual behavior due to threats. And the other punk is the canteen punk, and that is the person that performs oral or anal sex for items, for things, purchased on the canteen store or other items. And then finally, the wolf or the jocker, that's the image of toughness, though engages in homosexual acts. So this is the big, huge guy with all the muscles, and you'd think that he's just the big man, but he's actually performing homosexual activity while in prison. I've personally never heard of these terms in my 26 years in the Department of Corrections. I've heard of punk, but it has nothing to do with homosexuals in prison. So, and again, this is just for the book, but you might want to know these things in case you're asked about these, or you see these on a test or some kind of position paper. Okay, so those are just some terms that have been brought up about typology of inmates. Okay, looking at gay police officers, what are some challenges for officers that come out? Here in Sacramento, a couple of years ago, there was a gay pride parade put on by the city that's done every year, and a Sacramento police officer wanted to march in uniform because he was a homosexual, gay man, and chief said no, can't do it. And he fought it, and there was a lot of backing that he had from the community, and ended up that any police officer who wanted to join that parade, that gay parade, could do so in uniform. So now we have a lot of gay pride things, parades, and activities, and there's law enforcement officers in full uniform. Okay, so again, this is how far we've come, which is a good thing, since the early days of executing people for homosexual activities, or even the thought of that, or being investigated for that. So again, gay police officers, again, not everybody does that. Some do, some don't, but there is a balance now, which they can, especially in Sacramento. Legal and social implications, officers who work with gay partners. Have you ever worked with somebody that's a homosexual or gay? I have. I've worked with a lot of females that are gay, some males that are gay, and I knew gay people in the military. And from my perspective, to me, sometimes I didn't know, other times I did, but all we did was our job. That's all we did. We protected each other, we learned from each other's mistakes, and there was never an issue of somebody's weaker, or there was no name calling. So again, I'm sure that does happen. But in my experience in being a professional, especially within law enforcement, courts, or corrections, you put the job first and you do what you're trained to do. So it shouldn't matter whether the person's gay, straight, etc., black, white, orange. So again, I didn't find this to be an issue, especially nowadays. I'm sure years ago, 20, 30 years ago, it was. But now that there's more homosexuals that are out and talking about it, and we're having conversations, it's a lot easier. And again, I don't think it matters. Some people think it does. Again, that's your choice, depending on what you go into. But just remember, everybody has a story, okay, different from yours, of how they got to where they are. Talked about the courts. The biggest thing about the courts is that homosexuals or gay people that are witnesses, there's some jury members that may give them less credibility. Also, some jury members that are homosexual may have some harassment or discrimination or disparity, depending on the makeup of the jury. So again, a lot of issues when it comes to courts and disparity of treatment and homosexuals. And again, I've used the term homosexual and gay interchangeably. So again, there's certain parameters depending on who you're talking to. Somebody may tell you, hey, this is how I prefer to be called. So again, not that one's right or wrong, but just make sure you understand that it could be wrong unless someone tells you different. There is gay bias in courts. The book talks about that. What about a judge who's homosexual? Does that matter? Is the judge supposed to be objective? Absolutely. But is a judge ever subjective? Absolutely. So again, there could be some gay bias in courts. Again, a little bit of research that's been done. Any other issues with courts and homosexuality? Remember the lady justice we went over, and how there was the blindfold on her? So that's how justice should be, blindfolded, blind. Doesn't matter who you are, black, white, homosexual, straight, whatever. And by the way, one time I was driving in a car in my vehicle, and I was with one of my female partners, parole agents, and she's gay, and we're driving, and I'm asking her directions. I said, left here, right here, and I said, or do I just go straight? And she said, that's not a good term to use around me. And I said, it's not? She says, no. She said, forward is a much better term. So again, in her expertise of being homosexual, she did not like the term straight, because that would give a negative connotation to somebody that was not straight. So she said, just use forward. So anyway, just a little FYI about my experience with my partner, my great shooting partner, by the way, parole agent. Okay, women homosexuality in prison life. Prison families, they're basically, when females go to prison, California, they're involved in cliques and families. They're not involved in gangs. The prison family, though, has varied roles. You could be a mother, you could be a child, you could be a father, you could be a nephew, you could be a cousin, you could be a sister. But homosexuality does occur, but it's usually not forced. It's usually consensual, and it's not treated as such a high negative thing that someone would do while in prison in the female prison situation. So again, there's less violence in female prisons. There's no gangs, so the emphasis is on the relationships that are built within these families or cliques. So there's less violence that occur. So again, it's a totally different nature in a female prison compared to a male prison. And I never worked at a female prison, but I've talked to people that have, and it's completely different than a male prison. I've been told by many of my partners that work in female prisons, both females and males, that you have to talk to the female prisoners. They want to talk. They want to talk about everything. If you say, hey, inmate so-and-so, I need to see your ID card, go ahead and put your hands against the wall and spread your feet, I need to do a pat-down search. They're not necessarily going to do that like a male would, like a male prisoner. They'll probably stand there and say, well, why? And they want to have a conversation about it. So working with females is a little bit different. Okay, that's the chapter. It's a good chapter. Not that long, but you should read it. Very important. And again, we'll be having some more information about this chapter this week. And if you have any questions, go ahead and post them on the discussion board. And love to hear from you. And I hope you have a great day, and we will see you soon. Thank you.